The truck was a 2009 Ford F-250 Super Duty in faded gunmetal gray, the kind of truck that had earned its dents honestly, one panel at a time, over a long stretch of years that had required it to be useful rather than presentable. It was parked in the farthest corner of the Hargrove Energy Services lot in Midland, Texas, under a sodium vapor light that buzzed at the specific frequency of something that had been installed a long time ago and had not been replaced because it still technically worked. Inside the cab, under a Carhartt C26 firm duck blanket in dark brown, the kind sold at Tractor Supply Co. for $42, which he had bought because it was what a working person bought when they needed something that lasted, was a man named Daniel Pruitt. He was 51 years old. He had a plastic Coleman 16-ounce travel mug of gas station coffee that he refilled at the BP on West Illinois Avenue, where the coffee was $2.09 and had been $2.09 for 3 years without apology or variation. He had a legal pad on the passenger seat. He had a reading light that clipped to the sun visor. He had been sleeping in this truck 4 nights a week for 11 months. 3 floors above the parking lot, in the top floor suite of the Hargrove Energy Services building, in an office with glass walls and a view of the Permian Basin that looked, at night, like a low constellation of operational fires stretching to the edge of the visible world, a woman named Claire Hargrove was still working. She was 47 years old. She ran the company her father had built from a single drilling operation in 1981 into an independent energy company with $11 billion in assets across 3 basins. She had a Gulfstream G650 at Midland International Air and Spaceport, Hangar C, which her pilot pre-flighted every Monday and Thursday morning, because those were the days she most frequently needed to be in Houston or Denver before the morning's first meeting. She had 41 direct reports, 3 active acquisition targets, a pending regulatory matter in the Delaware Basin that her legal team had been managing for 8 months, and a habit of working until 11 at night and starting at 5 in the morning because the oil business did not observe the distinction between her schedule and its own. She had been using the parking lot security system for 6 months before she noticed the truck. And when she noticed it, she did not yet know what she was looking at. She would not know for another 3 weeks, when a facilities manager named Bobby Ruiz placed a note on her desk between her 7 a.m. express and her 7:15 production call, and the note contained a name that she looked at once, then looked at again, and then looked at a third time with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a person who has just discovered that a fact they assumed was settled is not settled at all. The name on the note was Daniel Pruitt, and what Bobby Ruiz had written beside it in the careful block letters he used for things he considered important enough to be legible without interpretation was, "He says he can fix the Permian water problem. I think you should hear him out." Claire Hargrove had not chosen the energy business. The energy business had been chosen for her, the way things are chosen for the children of people who build something and then keep building it until the building is the entire structure of the family's life, until the company and the family are so fully intertwined that the question of what you would have chosen otherwise becomes, at some point, genuinely unanswerable. Her father, Thomas Hargrove, had been a geologist from Odessa who had read the Permian Basin the way some people read people, with an intuitive accuracy that went beyond the available data, a sense of where the resource was and what it would take to get to it that had made him, in a generation of wildcatters, someone whose bets were watched. He had drilled his first successful well in 1978, 3 years before he formed Hargrove Energy Services as a legal entity, and he had used the proceeds of that well to drill 2 more and the proceeds of those to drill 5 more. And by the time Claire was 11 years old, the company had 11 active operations, and her father's name was the kind of name that opened certain doors in certain rooms in Midland, Texas, with a particular ease. She had grown up understanding that the company was not separate from the family. It was the family, or at least the skeleton the family was built on, the structure that organized everything else. Her father had not been absent exactly, but he had been present the way people are present who are also always partially somewhere else, with a portion of their attention perpetually allocated to the thing that needed them most, which was the company rather than the living room. She had not resented this. She had, as a child, and then as an adolescent, and then as a young woman returning from the University of Texas with a degree in petroleum engineering, understood it as simply the condition of the life she had been born into, the way you understand weather. She had joined Hargrove Energy Services at 24. She had spent 6 years in the field, not as a gesture toward credibility, but because her father had made it clear, without sentimentality, that the desk was earned through the ground and not the other way around. She had been on drilling sites in weather that did not accommodate preferences. She had understood failure modes that were only comprehensible if you had personally watched them develop. She had built the specific, untheoretical knowledge of a basin that comes from years of reading it directly rather than from reports about it. Thomas Hargrove died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday afternoon in September, in his office, at his desk, which was the desk he had bought second-hand from a closing insurance firm in 1983, and had never replaced because the desk still worked. In the specific stubbornness about things that still worked, that was one of his signature qualities. He was 73. Claire was 40. She had been the company's chief operating officer for 4 years and had been running its day-to-day operations for 2 of those 4 while her father's health had made the full executive role gradually impossible to maintain. She became CEO on a Thursday, 2 days after her father died. She did not take time. There was a pipeline integrity review on Friday that required her to be present, and she was present, and she ran the review with the exact precision it required, and she went home afterward and sat in her father's chair in the house on Wall Street in Midland where she had grown up, in the specific silence of a house that has lost the person who gave it its gravity, and she allowed herself one evening of that silence before the next thing required her. This was not performance. This was not the suppression of grief for the benefit of an audience. This was the way Claire Hargrove processed things, by continuing to move through them at the speed the situation required, the grief happening in the margins of the motion rather than as a separate event, the way rivers erode their banks through continuous passage rather than singular flood. She had run the company for 7 years as CEO. She had grown the asset base from $7 billion to $11 billion. She had navigated 2 oil price cycles, 1 federal regulatory challenge, and a hostile acquisition attempt from a Dallas-based private equity firm that had taken 4 months to repel, and had required her to make a series of decisions that her board had privately doubted and publicly supported, and that had, each of them, proven correct. She was regarded in the Permian Basin energy community with a respect that was slightly different from the respect they had given her father, because her father had been one of them in a way that she, as the woman who had inherited the chair, was not quite allowed to be, but that had weight and reality regardless. She had not married. She had been close to it twice, with 2 men who had understood the company's claim on her time in principle, and had found that understanding insufficient in practice. She did not hold this against them. She had simply understood at 34 and then at 39 that the configuration of her life did not have room in it for the kind of marriage either man had needed, and she had made the decision that she made all decisions with clarity rather than drama and had moved on. She had instead the company, the basin, the $11 billion in assets. The Gulfstream G650, registration N447HE, which her pilot Jackson Lee had flown for her for 6 years, and which he treated with the specific devotion of a man who considered the care of a well-built aircraft to be its own form of respect for the people who rode in it. She had the glass-walled office with the view of the Permian at night. She had the espresso machine, a La Marzocco Linea Mini in brushed stainless steel that she had bought at La Marzocco's flagship dealer in Dallas, and which she operated every morning herself because the ritual of it was the closest thing she had to a quiet moment before the day began. She had 41 direct reports and 3 acquisition targets, and a regulatory matter, and a water problem that had been getting quietly worse for 16 months, and that no one on her team had been able to solve. The water problem was this. Hargrove Energy Services operated 17 active wells in a specific formation in the northern Permian Basin, where the produced water, the water that came up with the oil and had to be disposed of, had a chemical profile that made standard saltwater disposal methods both expensive and, under the most recent EPA guidance, potentially non-compliant within the next 2 years. Her engineering team had brought in 2 consulting firms and a university research group. None of them had produced a workable solution. The latest report from the second consulting firm had arrived 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, and Claire had read it in 40 minutes and had put it on the credenza behind her desk in the pile she privately called the pile of well-intended expensive failures, which contained reports she had paid for and read and learned from and been unable to use. Cost of the problem, if it remained unsolved when the new EPA guidance took effect, was not trivial. Her CFO had modeled 3 scenarios, and the middle scenario, the one he considered most probable, was a compliance exposure of $60 to $80 million over 5 years. The high scenario was larger than that in a way Claire did not allow herself to think about often, because the thinking did not make the number smaller. She had not told her board the full scope of the problem yet. She had told them there was a regulatory development under active evaluation. This was true. It was also incomplete. She was giving her engineering team one more quarter to produce something usable before she expanded the scope of the board disclosure, because she had learned in 7 years that boards responded to problems better when the person presenting the problem also had the shape of a solution. She did not yet have the shape of a solution. But she was working on it, the way she worked on everything, systematically and without panic, with the deep professional patience of a person who has learned that most problems have answers if you are willing to look long enough and in enough places. She had not yet thought to look in the parking lot. Daniel Prout had been sleeping in his truck for 11 months by the time Bobby Ruiz left the note on Claire Hargrove's desk. He was not sleeping in the truck because he was destitute, or homeless in any of the conventional senses of that word, or because he had made the kinds of decisions that people who have not made them construct simple explanations for. He was sleeping in the truck because he had made a calculation, and the calculation was correct, and he had made it with the same precision that had characterized every calculation he had made in the previous 23 years of his professional life. The calculation was this: Midland, Texas, had experienced such a severe housing shortage during the most recent Permian Basin production surge that a one-bedroom apartment within 15 minutes of the Hargrove Energy Services facility rented for $2,200 a month, if you could find one available at all, which most months you could not. A 2-bedroom house rented for $3,400. Extended stay hotels in the area ran $80 to $110 a night for rooms that were clean in the functional sense, and not much beyond that. Daniel had run the numbers on a legal pad at the BP on West Illinois Avenue, using the same legal pad he kept on the passenger seat of the F-250 for everything he needed to think through, and the conclusion had been unmistakable. He could spend $26,000 over 12 months on housing that was not adjacent to the problem he had come to Midland to solve, or he could sleep in the truck 4 nights a week, shower at the Anytime Fitness on North Loop 250 West, where a $3 day pass was available, and a $24 per month membership was more efficient, and allocate the $26,000 to the research. He had chosen the research. This was not a difficult choice. It was the kind of choice that is only difficult if you weigh comfort against purpose, and Daniel Prout had never found that calculation hard to resolve. He had grown up in Crane, Texas, which was 40 miles southeast of Midland, and was the kind of West Texas town that the oil industry had built and partially dismantled and built again in cycles, and whose residents had developed, through those cycles, a relationship with impermanence that was not fatalism but something more practical. A learned understanding that things came and went on schedules you did not write, and that the appropriate response was to work hard during the coming and prepare intelligently during the going. His father, Roy Prout, had worked the Permian Basin for 30 years as a driller's hand and then as a tool pusher, and had died of a pulmonary condition at 62 that the company he worked for had contested was work-related, and that Daniel, who had by then been out of the basin for 12 years and had the technical background to read the medical and occupational literature, was certain was. He had not sued. The suit would have been long and expensive and would have required his mother to relive things she had spent 2 years moving away from. He had made the decision that you make when you understand the whole of a situation, including the parts that are not fair, and he had moved forward. His mother, Elaine Prout, still lived in Crane, in the house on Gaston Street that Roy had bought in 1987 for $62,000, and that was fully paid off, and which Elaine had converted the back bedroom into a ceramic studio, where she spent 4 afternoons a week making functional pieces that she sold at the Midland Odessa craft markets, and at a small gallery on North Big Spring Street in Midland that gave her a 40% commission and displayed her work in the window, which she described to Daniel as more than she needed and exactly what she wanted. Daniel called her every Sunday at 7 in the evening. He called from the truck, usually, parked outside the BP on West Illinois Avenue with the engine off, and the Carhartt blanket across his shoulders if it was cold. He told her what he was working on in the general terms that communicated the substance without worrying her with the specifics. She told him about the ceramics and the garden and the neighbor's dog that had started coming over and sitting on the front steps with the posture of a dog who had made a decision about where he belonged, and what was she supposed to do about that. He told her to feed him. She said she had already been feeding him. He said then the dog had solved his own problem. She said the dog was named Biscuit, apparently, according to the neighbor. He said that was a good name for a dog who had solved his own problem. He had been, before Midland, a water systems engineer. Not in the general, broad category sense of that title, but in the specific, specialized sense that described a career spent at the intersection of produced water management, subsurface hydrology, and what the industry called enhanced water treatment. The science and engineering of doing something constructive with the enormous volumes of water that the oil and gas industry brought up out of the ground and traditionally disposed of through injection wells. At significant cost and with growing regulatory concern. He had a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Texas A&M University and a master's degree in environmental systems from the University of Texas at Austin, which he had taken in night classes over 4 years while working his first job, because he had wanted the theoretical framework to match the practical knowledge he was accumulating, and because he was a person who did not stop at good enough when better was available to him. He had spent 8 years at a company called Aquastrat Solutions, which was a Houston-based produced water management firm that worked with independent and major operators across 4 basins. He had spent 4 years after that at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development in Ada, Oklahoma, which was the EPA office that did the scientific work rather than the regulatory work, the work of actually understanding what was happening in the subsurface, and at the surface when oil and gas operations moved water through the system. He had left the EPA for reasons that were professional rather than political, specifically because he had developed a theoretical framework for a class of produced water treatment that his supervisors at the research office had found interesting but not immediately fundable, and he had decided that the framework was correct and the funding structure was not his problem to solve. He had spent the 3 years before Midland developing the framework into something that was no longer theoretical. He had done this in a converted workshop behind a house he rented in Pecos, Texas, with $60,000 of his own savings, a partnership with a chemical supply company called Brentag that he had negotiated by demonstrating the technical specifics of what he was trying to do with enough precision that their Southwest regional manager had decided it was worth supporting, and a single piece of specialized equipment. A BioCube compact biogas reactor that he had purchased second-hand from a decommissioned municipal water authority in Lubbock for $11,000 and had retrofitted, over 6 months, with a sensor array and a control system he had built himself using Arduino Mega components and custom Python control scripts that he had written in the evenings after the lab work was done. The reactor sat in the converted workshop in Pecos on a workbench made from a solid core door he had bought at Habitat for Humanity Ray Store on East 2nd Street for $20. The reactor was, by the standards of what such things cost when built to specification, an extraordinarily inexpensive version of what it was. It was also, as far as Daniel could determine after 3 years of iterative development, the only working implementation of a specific electrochemical biological hybrid treatment pathway that could handle the precise chemical profile of northern Permian Basin, produced water in a way that was both economically viable and regulatory compliant under the incoming EPA framework. He had come to Midland to find an operator willing to pilot the system at scale. He had chosen Hargrove Energy Services specifically, not randomly, because his analysis of the northern Permian operators, done on the legal pad over 3 months before he loaded the F-250 and drove to Midland, had identified Hargrove as the operator with both the largest exposure to the specific water problem he had solved and the operational infrastructure that could support a field pilot without requiring the kind of capital investment that would make the economics unworkable. He had applied for a junior field engineer position through Hargrove's online job portal. This was not a deception. It was the method available to him, and it gave him proximity to the operation while he worked the problem of getting his framework in front of someone with the authority to act on it. The application had listed his full work history, including Aquastrat Solutions and the EPA Research Office and the Pecos workshop. The application had been processed by Hargrove's HR system, which was a standard ATS software called Greenhouse, which was very good at screening for the qualifications required for the posted position and not designed to read the full depth of what an applicant had done before. He had been hired as a junior field engineer. The salary was $63,000 a year. He drove the F-250 to job sites in the northern Permian, logged production data, wrote daily reports, and did the work that the job required with the kind of thorough, unassuming competence that causes supervisors to rely on a person without fully registering the depth of what they are relying on. In the evenings, 4 nights a week, he drove back to the Hargrove lot, parked in the far corner under the sodium light, and worked on the legal pad. Bobby Ruiz had been the facilities manager at Hargrove Energy Services for 12 years. He was 55 years old, from Odessa, the kind of man who had worked around large industrial operations long enough to understand that the people who actually knew what was happening at a facility were rarely the people with the largest offices, and that information traveled through organizations along routes that had nothing to do with the org chart. He had developed over 12 years an informal network of conversations with people at every level of the company, not as strategy but as temperament, because he was a person who was genuinely interested in what other people knew. He had been doing rounds one evening in the engineering wing when he had stopped at the break room for a cup of coffee and found Daniel Prout there, at 9:30 at night, with a legal pad and a manila folder of documents spread across the break room table. Bobby had gotten his coffee and looked at the documents and asked, because he was a person who asked, what he was working on. Daniel had looked at him for a moment. Then he had told him, not the summary version, not the version designed for a specific audience. The actual version in the specific technical language of what he had built and why it worked and what it would require to deploy at the scale that Hargrove's Northern Basin operations would need. Bobby Ruiz had a high school diploma and a lifetime of practical industrial knowledge. He had understood about 40% of what Daniel said in purely technical terms. He had understood 100% of the shape of it, which was that the man sitting across from him with the gas station coffee had solved a problem that the company had been paying consultants significant sums not to solve for over a year. Bobby had asked if he had told anyone. Daniel had said he had tried to schedule a meeting with the engineering department head 3 times and been declined twice and not replied to once. Bobby had nodded the way a person nods when they recognize a pattern they have seen before, the pattern of a message looking for a receiver through the wrong channel. "Let me ask you something," Bobby had said. "Have you put what you just told me on a piece of paper? The short version. The version that says what the problem is, what you built, and why it works." Daniel had looked at the legal pad. "Parts of it," he said. "1 page," Bobby said. "You give me 1 page and I will put it in front of the right person." Daniel had written the 1 page that night in the break room with a legal pad and a Uniball Signo 207 pen in black ink that he kept clipped to the front cover of the pad. He had written it in 30 minutes because he had been thinking about how to say it precisely for 3 years, and the precision was there, ready, waiting for the right format. Bobby Ruiz had folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and gone home. The next morning, he had added his own note to it, in block letters, and put it on Claire Hargrove's desk between her espresso and her 7:15 production call. Claire Hargrove read the note at 7:03 in the morning. She read it once at her normal reading speed, which was fast. Then she read it again, slowly. The 1-page document that Daniel had attached was not formatted in any of the ways she was accustomed to receiving technical proposals. There was no executive summary header. There was no company logo. There was no standard consulting deliverable structure with a methodology section and a limitations section and a bibliography. It was a legal pad page. She could see the faint lines through the photocopy Bobby had made. And it was handwritten. And it was the most clearly organized single-page technical document she had read in 2 years of receiving technical documents about this problem. It opened with a statement of the problem in 2 sentences that were technically precise enough that she knew immediately she was reading someone who understood the specific chemistry involved, not the general category. It described a treatment pathway in 4 sentences that she followed completely, which she could not say about 2 of the 3 consulting firm reports she had received. It stated the capital cost of a field pilot, the operational cost per barrel at scale, and the projected regulatory compliance position under the incoming EPA framework in 3 sentences. She turned the page over. On the back, in slightly smaller writing, Daniel had listed his background, Texas A&M Chemical Engineering. University of Texas Environmental Systems, Aquastrat Solutions 8 years. EPA Office of Research and Development, Ada, Oklahoma 4 years. Current position, Hargrove Energy Services Field Engineer. She sat with the page for a moment. And she called her head of engineering, a man named Greg Salas who had been with the company for 9 years and who she trusted with operational judgments in the way she trusted very few people, which was completely and with the specific expectation that he would tell her when he thought she was wrong. "Greg," she said, "I have a document on my desk. I need you to look at it and tell me whether the technical premise is sound." She sent him a photograph of both sides of the page. She waited 7 minutes. He called back and said, in the carefully modulated voice he used when he was managing a reaction he did not want to perform fully over the phone, "Where did this come from?" "One of our field engineers," she said, a silence of the kind that occurs when two people are looking at the same fact and arriving at the same place at the same time. "The chemistry is sound," Greg said. "The treatment pathway, I have not seen this specific integration before. I have seen the components separately, but not in this configuration. If the performance data holds, this is not an incremental improvement on what the consultants were proposing. This is a different approach entirely. Does it solve the problem?" Another pause. "I would need to see more, but the premise, yes, the premise solves the problem." She put the phone down. She looked out the glass wall at the Permian Basin, which was doing its morning thing in the flat West Texas light, the pump jacks moving in their patient a rhythmic way across the scrubland, the horizon straight and indifferent and enormous. She thought about the $60 to $80 million middle scenario. She thought about the pile of well-intended expensive failures on the credenza. She picked up her phone and called Bobby Ruiz. "The field engineer," she said. "Daniel Prout. Tell me where he is right now." Bobby said he was probably on the Highway 349 site, the routine gauge check, which would put him back at the main facility by noon. "I want to meet him at noon," she said. "Not in the conference room, in the break room on the engineering floor, and Bobby, don't tell him who he's meeting." There was a pause. "You want me to not tell him he's meeting the CEO?" "Correct," she said. "All right," Bobby said, in the tone of a person who had worked for the Hargrove family long enough to recognize when the instruction contained a purpose that would become clear. Daniel came in from the 349 site at 12:08, in his field clothes, Wrangler FR work pants in khaki, and a Bulwark FR button-down in tan that was regulation for field work involving ignition risk, with dust on his boots that was the specific pale caliche dust of the northern Permian. He had his legal pad under his arm. He had been in the field since 6 in the morning and had eaten a breakfast of a Nature Valley oats and honey granola bar, which was the bar he ate on field mornings, because it was one of the 3 items he reliably kept in the F-250's center console, along with the Coleman travel mug, and a small Leatherman Wave plus multi-tool in a belt pouch, which he had owned for 17 years, and which had been used on 4 continents in 3 different professional capacities. He came into the break room expecting to find Bobby Ruiz. He found Claire Hargrove sitting at the break room table with a cup of La Marzocco espresso in a small ceramic mug, which she had brought from her office because the break room coffee was, in her assessment, not coffee in any meaningful sense of the word. She was in a dark blazer over a white shirt, no jewelry except a watch, a Nomos Tangent in steel with a cream dial that her father had given her on the day she made COO, and which she wore every day because it was the watch her father had given her, which was sufficient. She looked at him when he came in with the same reading expression that she applied to everything: quick first pass, slower second pass, the second pass being the one that registered. Daniel Prout stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. He had not met Claire Hargrove personally in 11 months of working for her company, but he knew who she was in the way that everyone who worked for Hargrove Energy Services knew who she was, which was completely and with the specific understanding that the company and the person were not fully separable. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat across from her. He did not do what some people do in that circumstance, which is to immediately begin performing awareness of the power differential. He sat the way he sat everywhere, with the specific quality of settled attention that belongs to people who have spent a lot of time alone in the field or in a workshop being the only person in the room and have learned that their own presence is sufficient company. She put his 1-page document on the table between them. "Tell me everything," she said. "The complete version, not the 1 page. He looked at the document, then he looked at her. He said, "That'll take a while." "I know," she said. "I cleared the afternoon." This was not entirely true. She had cleared 2 hours, and she had Greta Nolan, her executive assistant, holding 4 things that could be moved. But she had said it because it was the right thing to say to a person who was about to give you the full version of something they had been developing for 3 years, which was that their time was not a constraint. He talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He covered the chemistry of the specific produced water problem in Hargrove's Northern Basin Formation, the reason existing treatment pathways failed at the economic threshold required for commercial viability, and the electrochemical biological hybrid approach he had developed and tested in the Pico's workshop. He described the BioCube reactor and the modifications he had made to it, and why those modifications produced the results they produced. He talked about the Brentag chemical supply partnership and the sensor array and the Python control scripts and the performance data from 31 months of iterative testing. He had brought nothing with him to the break room. Everything he said came from memory and from the legal pad that he occasionally glanced at, not to read from but the way a person glances at a familiar object as a kind of orientation check. The way you look at a compass not because you have forgotten which direction is north, but because the looking is part of the process. She listened the way her father had taught her to listen to technical people, which was completely, without preparing her response while they were still talking, because he had told her early in her career that the most expensive thing an executive could do was to listen to a technical expert in the mode of someone waiting for the part they already understood rather than the part they did not. She had followed this instruction for 20 years. It had served her in ways she could have listed but never fully quantified. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The Pico's workshop," she said. "Is the reactor still there?" "Yes," he said. "How long to move it to a field site and commission a pilot?" He thought about it, not performing consideration but actually running the logistics. 6 weeks to site prep, 4 weeks to commission. I would want 90 days of operational data before I called the pilot complete. "That's 22 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the document, she looked at the window, she looked back at him. "You've been a junior field engineer here for 11 months, she said. "Before that, Aquastrat for 8 years, EPA research for 4. Those aren't the credentials of a junior field engineer." He looked at her with a directness that she recognized as the specific quality of a person who does not soften things for comfort. "No," he said. "Why did you apply for that position?" "It was the position available," he said, "and it put me here close to the problem." She held this for a moment. "You came to Midland specifically to solve our water problem." "I came to Midland to find an operator with a problem I could solve," he said. "Your company had the largest version of that problem and the operational infrastructure to run a meaningful pilot. The analysis pointed here." "The analysis," she said. "Legal pad," he said. 3 months, it pointed here." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. The involuntary sound of a person who has encountered something that is both unlikely and, in retrospect, entirely logical. She had paid 2 consulting firms a combined $900,000 to produce reports that were thorough, professionally formatted, technically sound in their individual components, and collectively useless. A man in a truck in her parking lot working on a legal pad had solved the problem for the cost of a junior field engineer's salary and $60,000 of his own savings. "One question," she said. "Go ahead. Why didn't you come to me directly, before Bobby Ruiz? You tried the engineering department and were turned away 3 times. Why not escalate?" He looked at the table. He looked at her. "I tried the path that was available to me," he said. "Or the CEO of an $11 billion company, walking up to you uninvited and telling you I've solved a problem your consultants couldn't is the person you describe when you say it out loud sounds like a certain kind of person." He paused. "I was not certain I would be heard as the other kind." She understood this with the precision it deserved. She understood the full weight of what he had said, and she did not look away from it. "Would you have been," she said, "if you had come earlier, first month?" "Would I have listened?" He met her eyes. He was a person who she had come to understand in 100 minutes across a break room table did not soften true things. "I don't know," he said. "Probably not." "Probably not," she said. The sound of the building ran in the background, the faint hum of the HVAC, the distant sound of a field truck moving in the lot below, all of it operating on its schedule, indifferent to the weight of what was being said in the break room. She had sent him back to work at the end of the 2 hours with a commitment, not a corporate assurance but a direct personal one, that she would respond within 24 hours with a concrete proposal. She had gone back to her office and called Greg Salas and told him to clear his schedule for Thursday morning and that she wanted him, her CFO Marcus Webb, and her chief legal officer in the conference room at 8. She called Greta and had her reschedule the 4 held items. Then she sat in her chair with the view of the Permian and she thought about the truck. She had not yet asked him about the truck. She had seen it in the security camera footage the previous month, the F-250 in the far corner of the lot under the sodium light, and Bobby had told her then that it was a field engineer who sometimes stayed late. She had accepted this explanation because it was the explanation available, and she had been focused on other things. But now, with the full picture of who Daniel Prout was and what he had been doing in her parking lot for 11 months, the truck had a different meaning. She thought about the man she had just spent 2 hours with, The EPA research background, the PICO's workshop, the 31 months of iterative testing on a reactor he had bought secondhand and modified himself, the legal pad analysis that had pointed him specifically at her company, and the truck, the Carhartt blanket, the BP coffee. The Anytime Fitness membership. She called Bobby Ruiz at 4:30. The engineer who stays late, she said. He's sleeping in the truck, isn't he? A pause. I think so, yes, Bobby said. I didn't think it was my place to. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to have done something differently. I'm asking because I want to understand the full picture. She thought, after she got off the phone, about the Gulfstream G650 in Hangar C at Midland International. She thought about the La Marzocco in her office and the Nomos on her wrist and the glass-walled suite on the top floor. She thought about the consultants she had flown in from Houston and Denver on expense accounts that had totaled, across two firms, the better part of $1 million. They had arrived in Uber black cars and stayed at the Marriott Midland and had submitted their reports in professional binding with executive summaries and appendices. And the man who had actually solved the problem had been sleeping in his truck 17 floors below her office, under a $42 Carhartt blanket, drinking $2.09 BP coffee, because he had done the math on a legal pad, and the math said the solution was more important than the room. She sat with this for a long time. Not with guilt exactly, because guilt was a response to actions taken, and what she was feeling was something different, the response to a structure, to the invisible architecture of how the world organized its listening, to the fact that the channels she had built to receive information about her company's most pressing problem had been oriented in a direction that had required a facilities manager named Bobby Ruiz to be the bridge between the solution and the person who needed it. This was not malice. She had not built the structure with the intention of not hearing Daniel Prout. She had built it the way organizations build structures, by layering reasonable decisions on top of each other until the structure was complete, and then trusting the structure because the structure was what she had. The structure had not been built to find what it had not expected to be looking for. She went down to the parking lot at 6:15, not because there was a practical reason to go. She could have called. She could have sent Greg Salas. She went because she needed to see it, the way she had needed to see every difficult operational reality herself, directly, before she could properly understand it. The F-250 was there, under the sodium light in the far corner. The light buzzed at its specific frequency. The truck was empty. Daniel was still inside, finishing his shift report. She stood beside the truck and looked at it for a moment, the dented panels, the faded gunmetal paint, the clip-on reading light visible through the passenger window still mounted on the sun visor. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried readily, and she did not cry now. What she felt was specific and clear and did not require tears to be real. It was the feeling of a person who has understood something about the distance between what they built and what was needed, and who has made the private, binding decision, not dramatic, not announced, just made to close that distance. Daniel came out of the building at 6:40 with his field bag over his shoulder. He saw her standing beside the truck and stopped walking for a moment and then continued, and when he reached the truck he said in the tone of a person who does not perform surprise, "Ms. Hargrove." "I know about the truck," she said. He looked at her without particular reaction. "All right," he said. "How long have you been sleeping here?" 11 months, he said. 4 nights a week." She nodded. She looked at the truck. She said, "The residence inn on North Big Spring Street. I'll have Greta call ahead tonight and establish an account. Use it as long as you need to." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not gratitude performed, but the real thing, quiet and private and contained. "That's not necessary," he said. "It's not necessary," she agreed. "It's what I want to do." A silence. "The Thursday meeting," he said. "What's the format?" She appreciated this. The return to the operational, the person who did not dwell in the moment but used it and moved forward. "You'll present the technical framework," she said. "My engineering head and CFO will be there. Legal. I want them to hear the full version." "I'll need the legal pad," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Bring it," she said. The conference room on the executive floor of Hargrove Energy Services had a view of the Permian Basin that matched the one from Claire's office. The same flat horizon, the same operational fires, the same pump jacks in their patient erehithum. The room had a Crestron control system for the presentation screens and a life-size video conferencing unit for remote participants, and a Waterford crystal water service that Thomas Hargrove had used for board meetings, and that Claire had kept because she had not seen a reason to change it. Daniel Prout came in with his legal pad and a manila folder of documents that were the full record of 31 months of testing data from the Pico's workshop, printed on plain paper from a Epson Workforce WF2850 all-in-one printer that he had bought at Walmart on West Loop 250 for $89, and kept in the cab of the F250 for field documentation. He had not changed his clothes. He was in the same Wrangler FRs and Bulwark button-down from the field. Claire had not told him to change, and she had not wanted him to, because the field clothes were part of the actual picture, and she wanted her team to see the actual picture. Greg Salas was there, and Marcus Webb the CFO, and Linda Ochoa the CLO, and Claire. 4 people. No associates, no support staff, no documentation team. Claire had been specific about this. The meeting was for listening, not for producing a deliverable. Daniel presented for 90 minutes. He used no slides. He wrote on the legal pad and sometimes held it up to show a diagram or a set of numbers, the way a teacher works a classroom when the technology is beside the point and the thinking is the point. He answered questions as they came, not at the end, because he had told Claire before the meeting started that in his experience, the questions that came during were more important than the questions that came after, because the during questions were the ones that meant the listener was actually processing, rather than accumulating. Greg Salas had 3 questions that were technically precise enough that Daniel took actual time with each one, the time of a person who is not managing a questioner, but is genuinely working through the full answer. After the 3rd question, Greg looked at Claire and said, with the restraint of a man who had spent 20 years not overstating things, "This is real." Marcus Webb had 1 question. What is the capital cost of a full deployment across all 17 wells? Daniel gave him a number that Marcus wrote down and looked at for a moment, and then said, with the same restraint as Greg's, that it was significantly below the midpoint of the compliance exposure scenario, that it was not a question of whether the company could afford to do this, that it was a question of whether the company could afford not to. Linda Ochoa asked a single question about the EPA compliance position. Daniel cited a specific section of the Clean Water Act and 2 pending EPA guidance documents by their Federal Register docket numbers, from memory, which caused Linda to put down her pen and look at him with the expression of a lawyer who has encountered someone who has done their regulatory homework more thoroughly than most lawyers do. When he finished, Claire said, "Tell me what you need to move forward." He told her. A site assignment for the pilot, north of the formation, with access to a specific cluster of wells he identified by their production designation. A facilities agreement with the Pico's workshop for transport of the reactor. A purchase order for materials he specified by manufacturer and part number, including Dow FILMTEC reverse osmosis elements, and a Grundfos CM series chemical dosing pump, and 300 meters of HDPE pipe from JM Eagle, which was the pipe manufacturer he had used in the workshop testing, because their dimensional tolerance was consistent at the wall thickness the system required. 6 weeks of dedicated engineering time without field rotation. And 1 person, 1 employee of Hargrove Energy Services who he could work with day to day, and who could learn the system well enough to operate it independently after the pilot concluded. "I'll assign you Ramirez," Greg said, meaning Sophia Ramirez, a water systems engineer who had joined Hargrove 2 years earlier from a Houston environmental firm, and who was the person Greg considered his most capable technical hire in 5 years. "Good," Daniel said. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at Claire. "One more thing," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "The EPA compliance position under the incoming guidance. If this system works at scale, the compliance position isn't just defensible. It's better than compliant. It's a competitive advantage." He paused. "Other operators in the northern Permian Basin have the same water profile. They have the same problem coming. You'll have the solution first." A silence in the room that had a particular quality, the silence of people who have just understood that the conversation has become larger than they thought it was when it started. "You're describing a licensing arrangement," Claire said. "I'm describing what's true," he said. "What you do with it is your decision." He called Elaine Pruitt at 7 on Sunday evening, from the Residence Inn on North Big Spring Street, which was clean and quiet, and had a desk where he could work and a window that showed a parking lot that was not the Hargrove lot, which was a different kind of view, and one he was adjusting to with the particular adaptability of a person for whom the circumstances of a room have always mattered less than what the room contained. Elaine picked up on the 2nd ring, as she always did. She said she had been in the ceramics studio and was cleaning her hands, and was he all right? He said he was. He told her what had happened. Not all of it, not the technical version, but the shape of it, the way he had shaped difficult things for her since Roy died, in the terms that communicated the substance without requiring her to carry the weight of the full complexity. He told her that the work had found its way to the right person, that the problem he had spent 3 years building a solution for was going to be deployed at scale, that there was a meeting Thursday that had changed the conversation from whether to how. Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the tone she used for the things she considered important enough to say carefully, "Were they decent to you when they found out?" He thought about Claire Hargrove standing beside the F-250 in the parking lot in the sodium light at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening, in her dark blazer and her Nomos watch, saying, "That's what I want to do." He thought about the break room table and the legal pad between them and her cleared afternoon. "Yes," he said, "they were decent." "Good," Elaine said. "That matters. It doesn't undo the rest of it, but it matters." He knew what she meant by the rest of it. She meant the 11 months, the 4 nights a week, the Carhartt blanket and the BP coffee, not because she thought he had made the wrong choice she had never once suggested he had, but because she was his mother and the knowledge of it had cost her something, the quiet cost that parents carry for the choices their children make that are right and also hard. "How's Biscuit?" he asked. "Biscuit," she said in the tone she used for the neighbor's dog, "has apparently decided to stay. He came in the back door yesterday like it was his idea all along. Dogs solve their own problems," he said. "This one did," she said. "I bought him a bed, the orthopedic kind from Chewy. He's 14 and his hips are bad. Chewy has good shipping," he said. "Overnight," she said. "I wasn't going to make him sleep on the floor." A pause. "Are you sleeping in a bed now?" "I am," he said. "Good," she said. "That matters too." The pilot ran for 4 months, not the 90 days Daniel had projected. Because at 90 days the data was clear enough to be conclusive, and Sofia Ramirez, who had spent 4 months working with the system at the level of a person who was learning it to operate it independently, had suggested extending the run to 120 to produce a dataset robust enough for regulatory submission. Daniel had agreed because Sofia Ramirez was, as Greg Salas had told Claire when assigning her, the most capable technical hire in 5 years, and she was correct about the submission dataset. The system performed at the treatment efficiency he had projected in the PICO's workshop, within a margin of 4%, which in the context of a field deployment of a novel process was, according to Greg Salas, remarkable. The regulatory compliance position under the incoming EPA guidance was not simply defensible. It was, as Daniel had described it in the Thursday meeting, better than compliant. The produced water leaving the system had a chemical profile that met the incoming guidance by a margin that Linda Ochoa described, when she reviewed the data for the compliance filing, as documentation that made the company's legal position significantly stronger than if they had merely met the standard. The capital cost of full deployment across all 17 wells came in at 11% below Daniel's original estimate, because Sophia had identified during the pilot a modification to the HDPE pipe routing that reduced materials consumption without affecting performance, a modification that Daniel had written into the operating manual with her name in parentheses as the originator. Claire received the final pilot report on a Thursday morning, which was the same day of the week as the meeting in which everything had begun, a coincidence she noted without assigning it significance, because she was not a person who assigned significance to coincidences when the facts were doing sufficient work on their own. She read the report in 40 minutes. She called Greg, and Greg said what he had said in the conference room 4 months earlier without embellishment. "This is real." She called Marcus, and Marcus said the full deployment ROI was the best he had seen on an environmental compliance investment in his career, and that was including a methane capture project that had won a state energy efficiency award in 2019. She called Linda, and Linda said the regulatory submission was ready, and that she expected EPA acknowledgement within 30 days and formal approval within 90. Then she called Daniel, who was in the field at the pilot site with a Fluke 376 clamp meter checking the dosing pump's current draw for the morning log. "The report," she said. "Yes," he said. "It worked." A silence. Not a silence of surprise, because he had not been surprised by the data for 2 months. A silence of a different kind. The silence of a person receiving confirmation of something they had built and believed in through 3 years of workshop evenings and legal pad calculations and 4 nights a week of the Carhartt blanket and the BP coffee and the sodium light in the parking lot that buzzed at the frequency of things that still technically worked. "Yes," he said. "Come to the office tomorrow," she said. "We have things to discuss." The story moved the way these stories move in a particular industry in a particular region, which is not through media, but through the specific informal channels of the people who work in the field and know what problems look like and what solutions look like and can identify the difference. Within 6 weeks of the pilot conclusion, 2 other Permian Basin operators had called Greg Salas. Within 3 months, Claire had received a formal inquiry from a Denver-based independent that operated in the Weld County Formation in Colorado, where a different produced water profile was presenting a different but structurally similar problem. She called a meeting on a Tuesday morning in January, in the conference room, with the Waterford Water Service and the Permian View and the Crestron system that displayed nothing because there were no slides, because the person presenting did not use slides. She told Daniel what she was thinking. She had spent a month thinking it through, on evenings and on the Gulf Stream between Houston and Denver, on the yellow legal paper that she had started keeping on her desk alongside the espresso machine because she had found, in the 3 months of working with someone who thought in legal pad rather than PowerPoint, that there was a quality of thinking the legal pad produced that the formatted document suppressed. She was thinking about a separate technical services entity, wholly owned by Hargrove Energy Services, but structured to provide produced water treatment solutions to third-party operators. The entity would be capitalized adequately. It would have Daniel at its head, with the title of Chief Technical Officer, and the authority and the team and the budget that the title required in substance rather than merely in name. It would have Sofia Ramirez as its operations director, because Sofia had spent 4 months learning the system at the operational level and was ready. She had talked to her board about the concept, in the same selective way she had told them about the water problem, and the response had been, from the 3 members she had briefed individually, the specific enthusiasm that comes from people who recognize the difference between a company extending into an adjacent market, because the adjacency is logical, and a company doing so because it has a genuine and defensible advantage. "I need to know if you want to do this," she said. "Whether it's a good business idea, whether you want to do it. There's a difference, and I'm interested in the right answer." He sat across from her at the conference table with his legal pad in front of him, and he thought about Pico's, about the workshop, about 31 months of evenings with the BioCube reactor and the Python control scripts and the Brentag chemicals and the test data that had accumulated in manila folders, and eventually in the Epson WF2850 output. He thought about Roy Pruitt's lungs and the pulmonary condition that had been contested. He thought about Elaine in the ceramics studio, about the orthopedic chewy dog bed for a dog named Biscuit who had solved his own problem. He thought about the F250, which was still in the lot, because he had not gotten rid of it and was not sure he wanted to because it was a truck that still worked and he was a person who kept things that still worked. "Yes," he said, "I want to do it." "Then tell me what you need to build it correctly." He looked at the legal pad. He looked at the Permian through the glass wall. He looked at her. "Time," he said. "The right people, and the authority to say no to work the system isn't ready to take on. I'm not going to deploy this at a scale it can't support in order to satisfy a client timeline that doesn't account for the operational reality." "In writing," she said. "That constraint goes in your employment agreement as an operational prerogative, not as a policy, a contract term." He looked at her. "Bobby Ruiz told me about how organizations work," she said. "The things that survive are the ones that are written down." "He is," she said. "He's getting a title change, by the way, Director of Operational Intelligence. It means he gets the same access he already had but through a door that has a name on it." The corner of Daniel's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "The first stage of one. One more thing," she said. "Go ahead. The other operators in the northern Permian, the ones with the same problem, what's the scope if you run the numbers?" He had run the numbers. He had run them in January in the Residence Inn on the legal pad at the desk by the window that looked out at the parking lot that was not the Hargrove lot. He had run them carefully, the way he ran everything, with the specific honesty about uncertainty that made his estimates reliable, not because he was optimistic, but because he was accurate. 32 operators in the northern Permian Basin alone," he said. 16 have water profiles within the treatment parameters of the current system. 4 have profiles that would require a modified version that I believe is achievable. The other 12 are a different problem class that this system doesn't address. 20 operators, she said. 20, he said. She was quiet with this number. It was not a small number. In the specific context of what a produced water treatment system cost to deploy and what the alternative compliance exposure looked like for each of those operators, it was not a small number in any sense. "And Colorado?" she said. "I need to see the Weld County water profile data before I can tell you whether it's a direct application or a modification," he said. The inquiry was specific enough to suggest the profile is within range. I'd want a week in the field before I committed to anything. You'll have it, she said. Next month, I'll have Greta book the Gulfstream. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. You're putting me on the Gulfstream, he said. You're going to Colorado to evaluate a business opportunity for Hargrove Energy Services, she said. Yes, you're going on the Gulfstream. A silence. I have never been on a private aircraft, he said. I know, she said. I'm not sure what that requires of me preparation-wise. You bring the legal pad, she said. Jackson will do the rest. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at the Permian Basin in its January light, flat and wide and entirely itself. All right, he said. The Gulfstream G650, registration N447HE, lifted off from Midland International Air and Spaceport on a Wednesday morning in February, at 7:15, into a sky that was the specific clear blue of West Texas winter, the kind of blue that has no weather in it and no ambiguity, just the enormous clarity of a dry atmosphere in low humidity light. Daniel Prout had the legal pad. He had the Leatherman on his belt. He had a North Face Thermoball Eco jacket in black that he had owned for 6 years, and that had been with him in Ada, Oklahoma, and in Pecos, and in the parking lot of Hargrove Energy Services in 11 months of nights that ranged from the particular dry warmth of a West Texas summer to the cold that settled into the northern Permian in January, which was not a dramatic cold by national standards, but was a cold that was specific and physical and that the jacket had addressed, consistently. Without complaint, he sat in one of the Gulfstream's club seats, which were upholstered in a cream leather that was the kind of quality you identified by touch before sight. He put the legal pad on the fold-out table. He looked out the oval window as Midland fell away beneath the aircraft, the grid of streets and the flat geometry of the basin, and the pump jacks in their patient rhythm growing small and then smaller until they were a pattern rather than individual objects, the whole scale of the thing becoming visible only from the distance that altitude provided. He thought about Roy Prout, who had worked that basin for 30 years from the ground and never seen it from above. He thought about what his father would have made of the view, and he thought that Roy would have looked at it for a long time and then said something practical about what the geological formations looked like from this angle, because Roy had always been most moved by things when he could connect them to something useful, and the connection between what you understood from the ground and what you could see from the air was, for a man who had spent 30 years reading formations, genuinely useful. Claire was across the aisle. She was on her phone, the Houston call, her voice low and precise in the specific register she used for operational problems. The register that was not casual and not tense, but exactly between them. The register of someone who has been dealing with difficult operational realities for 20 years and has found the exact tone that is adequate to them. She got off the phone at 7:50 and ordered coffee from the G650's galley, the espresso, which Jackson's co-pilot Carmen Martinez made in the aircraft's DeLonghi La Specialista espresso machine, which Claire had specified when she had the aircraft's galley fitted out, because the La Specialista produced an espresso comparable to the La Marzocco Linea Mini in quality if not in scale, and she was not going to spend 8 hours in an aircraft drinking inferior coffee. She asked Daniel if he wanted coffee. He said he had his Coleman travel mug, which he had filled at the BP on West Illinois Avenue that morning before driving to the hangar, because the BP on West Illinois Avenue was on his route, and the routine of it was the kind of routine he did not abandon without a reason. She looked at the red thermos on the fold-out table beside the legal pad, and something moved in her expression, in the direction of something she had not expected to feel and did not have an immediate name for. "Tell me about Crane," she said. "I did," she said. "After the break room, I looked up everything." He nodded. He thought about how to describe Crane, Texas, to a person from Midland, which was how to describe a place that was the same kind of place but smaller and farther out, more fully exposed to the cycles of the industry, without the partial insulation that comes from being a regional center rather than a satellite of one. "My father worked the basin for 30 years, he said. "He died of a lung condition when he was 62. The company contested it." He said it plainly without request for a particular response. "My mother makes ceramics in Crane. She has a gallery in Midland on North Big Spring. She has a dog named Biscuit that belongs to a neighbor but has apparently decided to live at her house. And you left the EPA to build a solution to a problem your father worked around for 30 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a cleaner narrative than it felt from the inside," he said. "From the inside it was. I had a technical framework that I believed was correct, and the institutional path wasn't going to fund it, and I had savings, and I had a workshop in Picos, and the legal pad pointed at Midland. Both things can be true, she said. He looked at the window at the West Texas landscape moving slowly underneath, the scrubland and the caliche roads and the grid of the basin operations, all of it reading differently from above. Both things can be true, he agreed. A silence that had the specific quality of a silence between people who have covered the important ground and are now simply present with it. My father used to say, Claire said, that the Permian told you everything you needed to know if you were willing to listen to all of it, not the part you already understood, all of it. He looked at her. That's what you do, she said. You listen to all of it. He held this. Outside the window, the basin gave way to the caprock of the Llano Estacado and the landscape changed, the flatness becoming more absolute, more ancient, the specific flatness of ground that has been ground for an enormous length of time. Your father was right, he said. About the basin, about most things, I think, from what you've told me. He was, she said. He would have liked you. How do you know? He said. She looked at the window. Because you kept the truck, she said. He kept his second desk for the same reason. Things that still work. He was quiet. He thought about the F-250 in the lot, the dented panels and the faded gunmetal and the reading light still clipped to the sun visor. He thought about the $2.09 BP coffee and the Anytime Fitness and the Carhartt blanket and the legal pad and the 11 months of it, and how none of it had felt like hardship from the inside, because from the inside it had felt like work, the kind of work that was its own sufficient reason. Things that still work, he said. The Gulf Stream ran north at 41,000 feet, and below it the West Texas ground moved in its ancient slow way, and the sky was the blue that had no ambiguity in it. And in the front galley, Carmen Martinez was making a second espresso for the CEO, and in the cabin a man with a legal pad was writing something down. And whatever he was writing it in the same small compressed handwriting that got smaller and more precise the further into the page you went. Which was the handwriting of a person who had always had more to say than the available space, and had learned to make the space sufficient. In Crane, Texas, on a Wednesday morning in February, Elaine Prout was in the ceramics studio she had made from the back bedroom of the house on Gaston Street. At the wheel, with her hands in the clay, doing the thing she did on Wednesday mornings, which was to work on the functional pieces. The mugs and bowls and small plates that she sold at the Midland craft markets. The things that were made to be used, which she considered the most important category of thing to make. Biscuit was on his orthopedic bed from Chewy in the corner of the studio, which was where he spent his mornings now, with the air quality and the quiet and the specific comfort of a dog who had identified the right situation for himself and had declined to negotiate on the terms. She was thinking about her son. She did this while she worked, in the partial, background way you think about the people you love when you are doing something with your hands that does not require all of your mind, the thinking that happens in the margin of motion rather than as its own separate event. She was thinking about the Sunday call, about what he had said about the work finding its way to the right person, about the decent treatment, about the residence inn. She was thinking about the years before Midland, the Picos workshop, the EPA office in Ada, the Aquastrat years in Houston, all the years of a person building toward something with the patient, unhurried precision of a person who understood that the thing worth building took as long as it took. She was thinking about Roy. She thought about Roy often when she worked at the wheel, because the studio had been his idea in the last year of his life, when she had mentioned to him once that she had always wanted to learn ceramics, and he had said, in the direct, unornamented way he said everything, then do it. As if the presence of a desire was a sufficient argument for acting on it, as if wanting something and doing something about it were not separated by the kind of gap that requires other things to be arranged first. Just then do it, she had done it. 8 months after he died, she had signed up for a class at the Midland College Community Education Program. A Tuesday and Thursday evening class called Introduction to Hand Building and Wheel Throwing taught by a woman named Margaret Flores, who had been teaching the class for 12 years, and who was the kind of teacher who understood that people came to a ceramics class from many different places, and for many different reasons, and that the clay itself was often doing therapeutic work that the class description did not mention. She had been in the class for 3 weeks when she understood that it was not a hobby. It was the thing, the work that matched the shape of what she needed, the way Daniel's work matched the shape of what he needed, and the way Roy's work had matched his shape despite the costs of it, and the way Thomas Hargrove's work had matched his. There was something in their family, she had thought once, that was constitutionally unable to do things halfway, that encountered a thing that was the right thing and went all the way into it without looking for an exit. And this was sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful and usually, over the long measure, both. She put the bowl she had been shaping on the drying board and looked at it, the way you look at a thing you have made with the specific, honest judgment that knows what it needs and what it still lacks. It needed one more pull at the base. She would do that after it rested. She picked up her phone. She had a photograph on it that she had taken 3 days ago of one of the mugs she was most pleased with, a wide-bodied coffee mug in a celadon glaze that had come out of the kiln with a surface quality she had been working toward for 6 months. She had been thinking about sending it to Daniel. She had been thinking about it in the specific, sideways way you think about doing something for someone you love that is not practical assistance, but is the other kind of help, the kind that says, "I see you in it," the kind that is a mug rather than a word. She put the phone down and went to the shelf where the finished pieces waited before she priced them. She picked up the celadon mug. Wide body, good handle, the glaze pooling in the natural depth at the base the way a perfect glaze did when the firing went exactly right. She turned it in her hands. She would send it, not by Chewy, which was for orthopedic dog beds. She would drive it to Midland herself on Saturday and put it in a box with bubble wrap from the roll she kept in the studio, and she would take it to the FedEx on Andrews Highway and ship it to the residence in address Daniel had sent her. And she would pack it herself because she knew exactly how to pack a ceramic piece so that it arrived the way it left. On the side of the box, she would write his name. She would write it in Sharpie fine point-black marker, in the same handwriting she had used on the side of a Coleman travel mug 4 years ago, after she understood that the overnight shifts were going to be a feature of the work rather than a temporary inconvenience, the handwriting that had faded somewhat with washing but had never quite gone. She would pack the mug and she would ship it and it would arrive at the residence inn, and he would open it at the desk by the window with the legal pad and the reading light, and he would hold it the way he held things he was paying full attention to with both hands, because that was how he had held things since he was small, the things that deserved the full weight of his attention, and the mug was made to be held that way, which was why she had made it. Things that were made correctly were meant for the people they were made for. She had understood this from the beginning, from the first Tuesday evening with Margaret Flores and the introduction to hand-building and wheel-throwing class, the understanding that the object and its purpose were not separate, that to make something correctly was already an act of knowing what it was for. Roy had known that. He had known it about the basin, about the formations, about the pump jacks in their patient arrhythm, and the caliche roads, and the specific economy of working life that asked you to use what you had and trust that it was sufficient and do the work, and then do more of it. Roy would have understood what his son had done in Midland and in Pico's and in the parking lot under the sodium light. He would have understood it completely without requiring it to be explained, the way you understand the things that come from the place you came from and were built by the same materials as you were. She set the mug back on the shelf. She returned to the wheel. Outside the studio window, the West Texas February morning was doing what it did, flat and clear and enormous and indifferent and full, the Permian Basin going about its ancient patient work in all directions, as it had been going about it before anyone arrived to read it and would go about it long after. Biscuit lifted his head from the orthopedic bed and looked at her for a moment with the specific, calm attention of a dog who had found the right situation and was not confused about his reasons for staying. She looked at him. "What?" she said. He put his head back down. He closed his eyes. She put her hands back in the clay. She turned the wheel. Through the window the morning held its light, and in a different part of the country a Gulf Stream ran north at 41,000 feet, and somewhere in the basin below the aircraft's shadow moved across the caliche roads and the pump jacks, and the formations that held what they held, and the whole of it was connected by the specific invisible thread that connects the things people build, and the people who built them, and the people who received what was built. The thread that runs through the objects and the work and the mugs on the shelves and the trucks in the parking lots and the legal pads and the orthopedic dog beds and the wells and the water and all the patient, uncelebrated, absolutely essential work of the world. The wheel turned. The clay gave. The mug waited on the shelf to be finished and packed and sent to the person it was made for. Some things were made for specific people. The knowing was in the making.